Okay.
Before we start back up again, I'll say a few words.
Okay, sure.
I'll sit in the front row.
Hopefully. No, I got my notes. Yeah. Oh, I don't know.
Get out of spot and forget what you want to say.
Kind of got quiet in here all of a sudden.
Because we're getting ready to start here. I'll bring it down for you.
Thanks everybody for coming tonight. I had a feeling this would be a pretty popular subject. How many people have not been here before? Oh Jesus, everybody. That's awesome. Awesome.
You're popular.
Bob, knock it off. I don't need to introduce this guy. I'm sure everybody knows Matt, but I'm going to just because it will embarrass him. Matt serves as the director of Save the Flags, which is a project to preserve 240 flags carried by Michigan soldiers in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and World War I. He also directs the Tour and Education Service at the state capitol and serves as vice president of the Michigan Civil War Association. If any of you saw the news this past weekend, or some of us were there, we had a procession to put the replica battle flags back in the rotunda of the Capitol, and there was 80 of us.
Yeah.
And we stood on the steps of the Capitol and recreated the picture from when the original veterans put the flags in there in the first place. It was a goosebumps moment. I mean, it was very moving, and he sent out a video, or somebody sent a video out today of it, with some drone footage and stuff. That's really cool. That's on the Save the Flags website.
It will be.
It will be?
Yeah, it will be soon.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's on my Facebook page.
Thanks, Bob.
Well, just
Big
try.
help, I know.
Bob will do anything to get more friends on Facebook.
I mean, he's all friends with the kids. I never had any friends growing up.
So, his presentation tonight is to our country and to its flag, Lansing in the Civil War, Matt VanAcker.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. So I think, as Chris said, maybe most of you know me in my other iteration as the director and curator of Save the Flags. And sometimes I like to start these just by giving updates about the project, because a lot of you have been supporters of that and seem to click right off of that. Seem to be pretty interested in it. So a couple of developments. One, Chris just talked about. We had a really incredible event this past Saturday at the Capitol, and I did the best I could to try to invite as many people as I could think of, but I know I missed out on a few, and if you were one of them, I apologize that you didn't hear about it. But in 1909, the battle flags were moved from their original repository in the south wing, the first floor of the Capitol, the Military Museum. They were moved out to the rotunda cases where, I remember seeing them, and some of you probably remember seeing them as children. What they did though in 1909, the time they were moving the flags from the museum to the rotunda coincided with the Grand Army of the Republic's reunion in Kalamazoo, their encampment. So the vets asked permission of the state to take their flags out basically for one last hoorah and actually march beneath them. And there are photographs of the vets marching beneath the encased flags down in Kalamazoo. What was really neat though is they took the vets out front on the front steps with the battle flags and took photographs of them. Only one that I know of exists, this one photograph. I think there are 8 of them. So all of you are researchers, keep your ears and your eyes out for the other ones. Because if you look closely at the one photograph, all the flags in that photo with the vets are from one of the 8 cases in the rotunda of the Capitol. I'm convinced, why would they only take photos of one group of vets with one group of flags from one case? I'm really convinced that the other 7 photographs are floating out there somewhere, but the archives doesn't own them. So anyway, keep your eyes out for that for us. But so we, as Chris said, we recreated that event. I was able to get 80 descendants to come and some supporters of the Flag Project, many of whom are in the audience tonight. And we marched them out on Ottawa. We had the streets closed up Capitol and up the front walks of the building and up the front steps. We recreated the photo from 1909, and as Chris said, it was a kind of a goosebumps moment. The hair on the back of my head and what little hair is left on my head stood up literally on end. And it was the craziest thing. The flags hit Capitol Avenue, the breeze hit them, and they just bursted out, and they were all flying. It was the really neat experience. We're also, just to give you an update on flag conservation, Heritage Hall opened 2 years ago. It's a subterranean welcome center to the Capitol. As a part of it, I was able to convince the design and the people who were funding it to include a state-of-the-art conservation lab. So we are conducting on-site conservation for the first time of our battle flag collection right in Lansing in the underground facility attached to the Capitol. I've been able to have 2 of my staff train with our conservator out in West Virginia, and Cambria and May have gone out twice now to receive training from the nation's leading battle flag conservator. And they're bringing that knowledge back to Lansing and to Michigan. They're currently working on their 4th and 5th flag and stabilizing that and conserving them. So I'm super excited about that. And any of you that have never had the chance to see the flag collection, reach out to me. I'd be happy to show them to you. They have incredible stories to tell, and I know many of you have had the opportunity to do it already, but if you have not, please avail yourself of the opportunity to do that. But I digress. We're here to talk about Lansing and the Civil War, and I appreciate you all coming out. I really consider your presence here not as a recognition of my admitted shortcomings as an author, but mostly an important honor to the incredible service and sacrifice offered by the citizens and soldiers of Michigan, and in this case of Lansing during the Civil War. Your interest and support is a fitting tribute to the men and the boys who left Michigan and Lansing 160 years ago for the bloody battlefields of the Civil War. Let us not deceive ourselves for one moment. They were boys, mostly. Some historians have estimated that up to 20% of the Union Army was composed of boys under the age of 18, which is really incredible. Some of my research on Lansing, I found one young man who was 14 years old when he enlisted. These were boys who left their families, their homes, their very lives, and fought in 4 long years of horrific combat. And those boys who, God sparing their lives, were fortunate enough to return, came home changed, permanently maimed, and often haunted men. These are the stories you don't always hear about. We hear about PTS quite a bit these days. You don't hear about it as much from the Civil War. They went back to their families, to their farms and factories, and attempted to pick up the pieces of their lives that they had abandoned 4 years earlier. And they built this nation, and they made it what it is today. Years ago, very famous broadcast journalist, historian, and author Tom Brokaw very famously proclaimed that the World War II generation was the greatest generation. I cannot and I will not argue with his assertion, in part due to the fact that I'm a child of that generation. I believe, however, that there have been other great, and yes, possibly, perhaps, greatest generations. And I propose to you tonight that the men and boys and the families that supported them during the Civil War were a part of one of those greatest generations of their own. Boys like, this in the right place, Seymour Foster, who was a very young man, was a witness to one of the very first war rallies held in the chamber of the House of Representatives in the old Capitol in downtown Lansing. Seymour would come of age in the throes of the war. He would cease service with the 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters Regiment, Company B, in the bloody battles of the last year of the war, after enlisting at the age of 18. His older brother, Color Sergeant Charles T. Foster, who fought with the 3rd Michigan Infantry, Company G, which also formed in Lansing. With the regiment receiving its early training in Grand Rapids at Camp Anderson, Foster has been credited as being the first man to enlist from the capital city and would fight with distinction, carrying the colors of the regiment in the battles of the Peninsula Campaign, and sadly would also hold the distinction of being the first man from the capital city to be killed in action. Lieutenant Jack Whitman, who fought with the 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters, Company B. Jack left his job as a press foreman at the Lansing State Republican, which is the forerunner of the State Journal, and also left his wife and his 3-year-old son to enlist and form this Lansing-based company. Jack would lead his men into combat just after dawn on the small 24-acre field, of D.H. Miller near Sharpsburg, Maryland, on the banks of the Antietam Creek, September 17, 1862, a day that would hold the unenviable distinction of being the single bloodiest day in American history. My wife and I were at the cornfield just a few short months ago, and we were out near Antietam delivering battle flags for conservation and received his mortal wound. John Elder, who would end the war as a captain in the 8th Michigan Infantry, and his older brother Matthew, who formed and led the Elder's Wads of Company E, 8th Michigan Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which also formed in Lansing. You know, Lansing, even though it was the capital city, wasn't large enough to field its own regiment. There were only about 3,000 citizens. So instead, the boys that wanted to enlist formed companies within the city and then went off to the larger cities to join the regiments that were forming there. Matthew was a Mexican-American war veteran and a father of 5. And sadly, I've not been able to find an image of Matthew. This is his brother John. Raised his family, as close as I can tell. His house was somewhere near home plate is at the Lugnuts Minor League Baseball Stadium in downtown Lansing. Matt designed and oversaw the construction of the 2nd Ingham County Courthouse in Mason. He would go on to serve as an officer in the 11th U.S. Infantry Regiment and would see action at the Devil's Den near the small crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Matt also would be mortally wounded at Gettysburg just weeks after having his resignation from the Army approved due to the fact that his wife was severely ill and unable to care for their family of 5 children. I may be leaning on some of you for assistance with this. I'm trying to get his grave marked at Mount Hope Cemetery. His body was embalmed and brought back home to Lansing. His wife died shortly after he did, after he was mortally wounded, and I think just never got around to getting a headstone put up. There is a family stone, but not one that designates Matthew's final resting place. John Brode, who would serve with distinction with his friend Charles Foster in the 3rd Michigan Infantry. Before the war, John worked as a porter in the 1st Lansing Capital. He too would be horribly wounded at the Battle of Fair Oaks, Virginia, and would carry a Confederate bullet lodged behind his right eye the rest of his life. James Baker, who formed and led Company C of the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters Regiment and would be recommended for the Medal of Honor for action near the Peach Orchard at the Battle of Gettysburg. Before the war, James had served as a foreman in the chair caning department of the Lansing Boys Reform School. You'll hear more about that in a bit. He was one of 3 Baker boys who enlisted. Regimental Surgeon Dr. Orville Chubb of Lansing, who administered to the medical needs of the officers and the enlisted men of the 20th Michigan Volunteer Infantry Regiment, including the Lansing men of Company A. I have a real affinity for the Company A boys because most of them were state employees that left their jobs in Lansing working for the state to enlist with Company A. After Chubb's horrendous wartime experiences, which included scores of field amputations, he swore off practicing medicine the remainder of his life, moved to Minnesota, and took up the peaceful pursuit of farming. Chubb's story is a sad one indeed. Swears off practicing medicine after the horrendous things he'd experienced. He and another Lansing boy decide after the war that they're going to herd a herd of sheep to Minnesota and start sheep farming in Minnesota. Imagine herding sheep from Michigan to Minnesota. They get to Minnesota and about 1.5 of the sheep survived the herding. He gets there and realizes he has no way of making a living, so he has to hang his shingle out again and practice medicine until he can raise enough funds to get his start in farming. And it's just a really sad story, but he becomes a pillar of the community where he moves after the war. Chubb was one of 4 doctors from wartime and post-war Lansing who enlisted and rose to the ranks of regimental surgeons for the 8th and the 20th Infantry Regiments and the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, including Henry Brooks Baker, who ironically enlisted as a private, but quickly worked his way up in the ranks of the Army Medical Corps and ended the war after serving as an assistant surgeon in charge of several medical wards at the regimental, brigade, and division level, despite his lack of a formal medical degree. Baker would survive the war, get his medical degree finally, and go on to found the Michigan State Board of Health. Alan Shattuck, who also served in the 3rd Michigan Infantry from its formation until his wounding at the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864, where his arm was shattered by a Confederate minie-ball. Upon his return to Lansing, Allen started a small house painting company. He held the contract for the first painting of the newly constructed 1879 state capitol, climbing the daunting heights with the use of his one good arm. I'm actually working on an article right now for the Michigan Chronicle about Alan Shattuck. Really fascinating man. The 500 others who left the comfort and warmth of their homes and their hearth fires and fought in 4 long years of combat in their attempt to preserve our fragile nation, to end the scourge of slavery in this country. Each of the 500 have their own unique, harrowing, courageous stories to tell. This book is my attempt to help them tell those stories. This book is also a tribute to the fortitude of the city of Lansing. When the war came, Lansing was struggling to create its own identity. This included the fight to get a railroad and a telegraph connection. We were the capital city, for God's sakes, and we did not have a railroad or a telegraph connection. The formation of the Boys Reform School and the Michigan Female College, as well as the commercial, political, social, and religious institutions and the basic infrastructure that was necessary to support the honor and the great responsibility of having been designated as the capital city of Michigan. This struggle was only exacerbated by the Civil War and the essential military, financial, and personal contributions necessary to help win and end it. Plus, Lansing was constantly fighting against Detroit that wanted to get the capital back to Detroit, and a lot of other large cities in Michigan that were fighting for the honor of being named as the capital city. This book is also a tribute to the hundreds of Lansing citizens who contributed so greatly to the cause. Citizens like Harriet Tenney, who served as the president of the Ladies Military Aid Society and was responsible for coordinating donations of money and supplies to send to the boys in the field. And she would later serve with great honor and distinction as the state librarian, the first woman to hold this position. You know, all of us on our staff at the Capitol are supposed experts in certain areas of history, and I have a dear friend and colleague who Harriet Tenney is her thing. She's the Harriet Tenney expert, end-all expert, and not that interested in the Civil War, which boggles my mind, and I'm interested in Harriet Tenney, but not as passionately as Valerie is. You look for a book from Valerie at some point on Harriet Tenney. The work of the military aid societies, including the Lansing societies, is, I believe, greatly undervalued and underappreciated. And I'll admit, I didn't know a lot about the ladies' aid societies until I started researching. These benevolent societies did so much to assist the soldiers countrywide, donating over $5 million in funds and over $15 million in supplies. In early January of 1863, Albert Cowles from Lansing wrote a lengthy thank you letter for a 600-pound crate that had been forwarded from home to the Lansing-based Company A of the 20th Michigan, with which he was serving. He wrote, quote, "That box of which we had heard so much and for which we had anxiously looked so long arrived in camp. If the ladies of Lansing could have witnessed its reception, if as each received his package or packages, they could have heard and seen the expressions, for as much could be seen as heard, I think they would have been paid for all the trouble it cost them." I love this quote. "It would have reminded them of a large family of children anxiously awaiting Christmas morning. We were pleased to find that those who were recruited out of the city were not forgotten." Another important figure was Fanny Foster, who served as president of the Young Ladies Loyal League of Lansing. Fanny had two brothers, Charles and Seymour, who were fighting in the Army, and would later marry Lansing veteran Albert Cowles shortly after the end of the war. Abigail Rogers, who along with her sister Delia founded the Michigan Female College in Lowertown. While the boys of Lansing were fighting, some of whom were actually educated at the female college when it was initially a co-ed institution. The Rogers sisters were running a groundbreaking institution that would so greatly contribute to the formation and education of many notable young ladies of Michigan, many of whom would go on to champion rights for women in the following years, including universal suffrage. Abigail also personally visited the battlefields, offering aid to the Lansing soldiers. After the college closed, the site would later become the Michigan School for the Blind, where Stevie Wonder spent some time. And after its closure, has very recently been developed for mixed-use apartments and housing. I drive by, part of this building still exists. I drive by the campus every morning on my way to work. And it does my heart good when I drive by, and one of the signs that marks one of the buildings is called the Abigail, in honor of the founder of the college, the female college, Abigail Rogers. Theodore Foster, who served as the superintendent of the State Reform School, was a city clerk, editor of the State Republican, and prior to his time in Lansing, operated a station on the Underground Railroad, assisting escaping slaves to freedom in Canada. And his wife, Frances Foster, the Foster family were everywhere during the Civil War in Lansing. Frances, who if assisting her husband in his work at the Reform School and as editor of the State Republican and supporting local war efforts was not enough, also contributed her two boys to the cause. The young men of the State Reform, giving not only of their labor and their treasure, but many also enlisting, some of them after having been given tickets for early release. Over 150 of these boys, some of them as young as 14, would enlist to fight in the Union Army. You know, the state had established the Boys Reform School, but when the war hit, Michigan was spending all of its treasury on the war effort, so they started cutting back funding the State Reform School. The thing is all the judges didn't want to send these boys to prison, so they were all opting to send them to the Reform School in Lansing, and the appropriations were being reduced to the Reform School. So the folks that were running the Reform School were in real trouble, basically trying to feed all these boys. So they realized the legislature had agreed to early enlistments with parental approval or a judge's approval. So they were, honestly, I hate to say it like this, but almost killing two birds with one stone by offering early release to these boys from the Reform School, meaning that they wouldn't have to feed them. And yet they would also be contributing to Lansing's quota under the Conscription Act. So they were living in Lansing at the Reform School, so all the boys that enlisted from Lansing were credited to the Lansing quadrants under the Conscription Act, so they kind of served a dual purpose. Of the 500 men who fought from Lansing, and again, this is keeping in mind, it's a population of about 3,000. This is over half of the eligible male population of the city that enlists. And it's in keeping with the over half of the eligible male population in Michigan that enlists. Of the 500 men who fought, 20%, over 100 of them, would never return. 1/3 of them killed in action, like our friend Lieutenant John Jack Whitman, and others dying from disease on the battlefield or in Confederate prisons very far away from home. In the late summer of 1862, when Company A of the 20th Michigan Infantry was leaving for their camp of instruction in Jackson, a farewell letter was published in the local paper, the Lansing State Republican. A few excerpts of which I'd like to share with you. Quote, "We do not think that a company has been raised in the state that embraces more real merit and intelligence. They are the cream of our county, and their absence from among us will be seriously felt by all. No man with a heart in his breast can look upon this fine body of young men going forth to battle to offer up their lives, their all, upon the altar of their country to crush this unholy, monstrous rebellion, without having his feelings well up within him with such force as to bring tears to his eyes. May God bless them, and may they all live to return again to their friends, is our fervent prayer. Let them know and feel that they are remembered and cared for at home, and that they are dear to us, for we have given of the best we have." I love that line, "for we have given of the best we have." Is that not true for all of Michigan? So Chris had asked me to take a break about halfway through so you all could stretch your legs and get a cup of coffee. Is that correct, Chris?
Yes.
All right, we'll take maybe a short break and then we'll get back into it.
I just want to take a minute and kind of call to attention some of the stuff that's been going on here.
Ladies and gentlemen,
We've got some new displays. I'm sure everybody knows the ship display. That came from a library up in Bad Axe. They were remodeling their library and didn't have room for it and offered it to us. We get new artifacts all the time. It's crazy how the stuff comes to us. Some people find it on eBay and then send it to us. Some of it's in collections that people want to send to us. We're adding stuff to our database almost constantly. Every artifact is entered into a database and given an inventory number. And Keith started us on a good foot with tracking everything that's in the museum, whether it's donated, loaned. We survive by people's generosity. That being said, I'm going to pass the small. We survive by sponsorships and donations and putting on programs like this. We're very grateful for Matt to take his time to come out tonight, especially after I'm sure he had a very busy weekend with the Flags program.
Happy to be here.
I saw the Flags program come up on the calendar, and I'm like, oh, geez, he's stacking one thing right on top of the other, and sure enough, here he is, and we really appreciate it. We'll have the upstairs open for tours afterwards. Some of you may or may not know the upstairs is set up just like the Grand Army would have used it for their meetings, following largely Masonic principles, so we'll have that open for tours. You have to go outside to go upstairs because they were considered two separate buildings. This floor of this building was rented out to different businesses throughout the year, so it's been a bowling alley, a drugstore, and different things like that. Another thing I wanted to mention is the Michigan Military Heritage Museum in Jackson. If none of you have ever been there, is a very cool museum. They cover the whole spectrum of wars. It's not just Civil War, Grand Army. They've got some really great Vietnam era artifacts on display, and they're having an open house encampment type thing on. Bob, what's the date for that event in Jackson?
I believe it was the 28th of September.
28th of September. We'll have it on our calendar on our website. We'll have our travel display down there. We'll also be at the Jackson Muster this coming weekend. We'll have our travel display. If you've not ever been to that, which probably most of you have, that's kind of where I got my start reenacting. But that's a cool event. Tell your kids, your grandkids, your friends, your family about this place. I have people come in here time after time after time. We've been here 11 years, and I still have people say, I didn't know this was here. And it just boggles my mind because I'm on Facebook and emails and constantly work to advertise this place. And that can expound itself exponentially if you folks talk about us and help spread the word. So if you haven't signed our guest book and get our emails and stuff, I recommend you do so. I try not to blast people's emails up because I hate getting junk email all the time. But just tell your friends and family about us. We'll open for private tours anytime. I've given tours at 10 o'clock at night before. And we're open every Wednesday until Labor Day, and then every third Saturday we're open. So there's a lot of options there for people to come and visit us. And with that, I'll give it back to Matt. Thank you.
Chris had asked me actually to talk about another project I'm involved in. To those of you that just bought books, thank you, but I want you to know that I'm not profiting from the sale of these. All the money will go to the Battle Flag Project, but also to the Antietam Monument Project. I'm really honored to serve on that board. It's a group that came together, and Jack Dempsey's been out to talk here on some of his books, and Brian Egan has been out to talk about his book on Antietam. But our goal is to have a monument built honoring the 2,000 boys who saw action, Michiganders, at the battlefield of Antietam. Michigan never saw right to put a monument up to them. So, and we are working on that. We've hired a really wonderful artist. And we're just starting to see some of the samples of his work with the statue that he's putting together. So, and Bob asked me to yield my time for a few minutes to him.
Thank you, sir. We have a couple of special people in the audience tonight that requested a few minutes of our time, so if you will indulge us just a little bit. Ed Malinsky and Pat Carroll, if you would come forward, please.
Hello. As he mentioned, Pat Terrell and me, Deb Leslie, and we're on the Eaton County Historical Commission, and we have a little job here tonight that we want to take care of. I was one of the early founders of this museum back when we thought it was going to be a Civil War museum, and we thought we were going to have to fundraise for the money to buy this building. Luckily, things have changed over the years. One thing that has changed drastically was the loss of Keith Harrison. Besides losing a good friend in Keith, many of us worried about the future of this museum. Keith was an incredible asset to have in charge of the museum. He lived and breathed this place, and it went from a sad collection of artifacts leaning up against the walls to the wonderful collection that we see here today. But we lost Keith about a year and a half ago, and the museum is still standing. There are new displays and wonderful programs like the one we're having tonight. The Eaton County Historical Commission want to recognize the efforts of Chris Allen, the current museum president, for all the work he has done to keep the museum going and to advance it. So we get being awarded our Heritage Award. Keith would be very happy with this, I'm sure. Chris had some very big shoes to fill, and we think he has been very successful in doing so. A special thanks also to his board members and the volunteers who have also contributed to this success. We want to thank Chris for all that he has done to help preserve and protect the history of the Grand Army of the Republic in Eaton County, and we'd like to present him with our Heritage Award for 2024. He's in good company this year. The other 2024 recipients include Pat Terrell here for her work on the Dyer Kiln in Bellevue, and to Bill Stockhausen for his Gothic mill restoration in Bellevue. All are very deserving. Congratulations.
Thank you. Embarrassing. This is the second award I've gotten in the last 2 weeks because I got one from the Sons of Union Veterans, Founders Award from the Sons of Union Veterans at the National Encampment in Kentucky, I think it was. So thank you very much. This isn't me. This is all of us. We have an incredible board of directors. One of our newest board members, Lily Morris, is doing our video for us tonight. All the volunteers, we ran out of coffee cups, and I asked one of our volunteers to run to the store and get coffee cups for us. It's all these little pieces make this happen. So thank you very much.
All right. So, Chris was talking about getting donations, and I got to share one quick story again back to the flag project. Maybe a month or so ago, I was contacted by a gentleman who said that they had what purportedly was a piece of a battle flag that his wife had picked up at an antique mall in Allegan, Michigan, about 15 years ago, and he said, I was hoping you could authenticate it. So I said, well, can you send me a photo of it? So he sent me an image, and there in silk is the head of a bald eagle, and it measured maybe 4.5 by maybe 4.5, the other way. And I said, well, what do you know about it? And he said, well, there's a card on the back of it that says it was supposedly, associated with the 15th Michigan Infantry Regiment. So me, being the person I am, I go to our battle flags. I looked for a regimental that would have had a bald eagle painted on it, and wouldn't you know, the regimental for the 15th, the bald eagle is gone, the head is gone. And I said, oh my God. So I said, bring it in, I would love to see it, get some photos of it, and I'll show you the collection. So he and his wife, Kevin and Terry, came, and I spent about 2.5 hours with them in the battle flag storage space. And Kevin is descendant of a man who fought the 26th Michigan, so we were looking at all the flags, and then we pulled the 15th flag out and laid their little fragment on it in its frame, and I'm about 99% certain it came from that flag. So I looked at him and I said, can I take some photos for our records? And they looked at each other and they looked at me and they said, no, we're donating it. So a little piece of flag, and it gets even better. Kevin and Terry were at the event Saturday carrying a flag of a replica flag of the 26th Michigan. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to be able to say with 100% certainty after I do some more research that piece of eagle actually goes with that flag in the 15th. So anyway, it's just kind of a neat story, and I just don't get people that don't like history. I don't know. I just thought that was a really neat story. So speaking of stories, I said I believe that this story about Lansing and the Civil War was a story that needed to be told. Honestly, my only apprehension in taking on the role of author was that I would not do justice to the story, not do justice to the boys. So this is my very humble attempt at telling what I think is an important story, the story of a small city. You don't think of capital cities as being small, but Lansing is still small compared to other capital cities. It's a small city that stepped forward to contribute her voice, her money, her all. For we have given of the best we have, to an incredible effort in support of a war that would bring freedom to 4 million people held in bondage. Our Lansing boys would see combat in the eastern and western theaters of the war, in this battle of Bull Run to the last battles leading up to the Confederate Army surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Their bodies, sadly, would be scattered across those battlefields, and one would find his final resting place in the salty sea. Their sacrifice ultimately ensuring freedom to those held in bondage and the continuance of our nation in this incredible experiment in democracy. So my initial concern in committing to writing this book was that someone else had already done it. I realized, however, early on in my research that no other book had been written about our city during the Civil War. I have a lot of Lansing friends who are historians of the city, and I reached out to each of them and I said, where's the resource for this subject? And they said there are no resources for it. Nothing's really been written about Lansing during the war. There were a few papers, there was some scattered research tucked away in various places, some recollections of the soldiers and the citizens of the war years, but nothing in one source. As I started to pull together the information and more fully realized the depth of the city's contribution to the war effort and the depth of the stories that I needed to share, my fear then became very quickly that someone else would write it before I got a chance to write it. This after 160 years, to my great fortune, this was an unfounded fear. So I kept thinking, how does an author or a historian totally immerse themselves in a time period? And my hope was that I could do that somehow, immerse myself in the life of the city in the 1860s. What I would have given to go back in time and have spent even just 1 hour in Lansing in 1861. So short of time travel, how does an author and a historian immerse themselves in a time period? I'll tell you how, through the glorious internet research tool that is newspapers.com. To my great fortune, every single edition of the Lansing State Republican, what we all know now as the Lansing State Journal, is online. Granted, it was a very Republican paper, so their bias was very obvious. I spent the better part of a full year reading every Republican paper from 1859 to 1866. I read every column, every article on every page, even reading all the advertisements from the local merchants. You can learn a lot about an area and a time period from reading the ads. I have to admit I may have skipped a few of the self-help articles. I don't need any help, right? Tips for farming, which included advice on the early shearing of sheep, how to properly treat dwarf pear trees, the proper application of manure, and a shockingly large number of articles on the proper techniques for the castration of bulls and roosters. I have to admit, though, I did find the articles on beekeeping very interesting and still pertinent to my own beekeeping hobby. But I digress. What a treasure trove of information. By the time I'd read 7 years of papers and clipped out every pertinent article, I had a strong foundation for the writing. I don't want to give myself too much credit here. I should mention that the task was not nearly as daunting as one would think. The Republican was only published every Wednesday. It was only a 4-page paper, and it was a mere 7 columns per page. I'm also indebted to the dozens of soldiers' correspondents who wrote long, detailed letters home to their families and to the Republican, most of which were dutifully published in the paper. A large number of men worked actually in the press rooms of the Republican before they enlisted. So of course they're going to send letters back to their former employer, to the editors of the paper. The letters are moving, at some points incredibly funny, and so very, very vivid. They describe the soldiers' enlistments, their journeys to the camps of instruction, their camps, their surroundings, including touring Washington, D.C., like a bunch of 8th grade students on an annual field trip. One soldier remarked in his letter home that he had lived more in the last week than in his entire life up to that point. Think of these farm boys from Lansing going off to the nation's capital. Just incredible. They spoke of their training, their uniforms, or their lack thereof, their pay, or their lack thereof, what they were eating, what they wished they were eating, what they were missing at home, what they were not missing at home, and then finally, in brutal, remarkable, and graphic detail, the horrors of combat. In reading the papers and those very personal letters, a transformation occurred within me. These long deceased people became good friends of mine. I started making very real connections with each of them, remembering the names of their children, where they lived, what they did for a living, which church they attended, what vegetables and fruits that they grew in their gardens. In short, making good friends of all of them. And when the boys enlisted and the ever-increasing casualty lists were published in the paper, I too suffered with them, with my new friends from my hometown and their great and unbearable loss. With your permission, I'd like to read a portion of one of those letters that I've also included in my book. Edward West Flower was 22 when he enlisted in the Lansing-based Company E of the 8th Michigan Infantry Regiment. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, and at a young age moved to Lansing, where he was working as a clerk. In his year of service, Flower sent numerous reports and letters back to the Republican. In a letter dated April 19, 1864, he reported that they were, quote, encamped in a very pleasant place. We have not yet had the chance to see the return of the regiment to the We have not yet had a chance since the return of the regiment to the field to try our fighting qualities. We shall have the opportunity of showing the enemies the kind of stuff that Michigan boys are made of. Less than 1 month later, Flower's enthusiasm for fighting would be well satiated in the overland campaign and in the tangled undergrowth of the wilderness. In a letter to his parents dated May 10th and subsequently published in the Republican, Flower wrote of the carnage and the brutality of war. Quote, "I expect you are getting more than anxious to hear from me. I am lying in a rifle pit behind breastworks with the shells from the batteries of both our own and the rebels passing over our heads. We have had a very severe and trying time. No one but those who actually experience the perils and the sufferings of the battlefield can imagine the reality of it. It seems like nothing else than God's merciful providence that I have been preserved. The old soldiers say it was the worst battle they were ever in. I feel lonesome enough here now. Of all the boys that came with me, I am the only one left." Flower continued the letter to his parents. "We arose up with a yell and drove the fleeing regiment back again, when suddenly a force 5 to our 1 rose up and charged upon us. From then until sundown, it seemed as if the bullets came in perfect showers. I had hardly the strength to load. The sweat rolled off of me, and the smoke and the powder blinded me. Davenport fell dead by my side, another one severely wounded behind me, and others falling all around. I felt sick. We lost our Colonel Frank Graves, together with 2 captains and about 50 privates killed and missing, and 100 wounded. Pray daily for me, that whatever befalls me, I may be ready for the issue." Along with Flower's published letter home to his parents was also a report from the 8th Acting Commanding Officer, Captain John Elder of Lansing, written after the aforementioned Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, Virginia. The colonel of the regiment had been killed, so it became Captain Elder's sad duty to report the losses of the regiment. Dateline, May 14, 1864. From the camp of the 8th Michigan, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Virginia. "Again we have met the enemy. It is now raining and I am sitting on the ground writing. Therefore I will not give a detail of the battle, but merely give you a list of the casualties of the regiment in killed, wounded, and missing. What followed were 2 full newspaper columns of the casualties of each company of the 8th Michigan, including Company E from Lansing. Could you imagine reading about the welfare of your loved one through the cold columns of the newspaper? Sergeant Jerome Beardsley, killed in action. Tallman Barnum, ankle severe. Albert Blood, arm severe. Charles Broke, arm severe. Simpson Kaufman, arm amputated. Thompson Davenport, killed in action. Charles Terrell, hand slight. Mark Klein, shoulder severe. Matthew Fitzpatrick, killed in action. Andrew Van Heuven, arm slight. Ira Davis, leg slight. Heinrich Farmall, finger amputated. Andrew Dietz, missing. At the end of the war, Captain Elder addressed his men. "After 4 years of war, carnage, and bloodshed, you a few are permitted to return to your respective homes, there to enjoy that peaceful bliss which none but a soldier can fully appreciate. By your patriotic devotion, you have obliterated every vestige of that cursed institution, slavery. Make no bones about it, friends. The Lansing boys were fighting to end slavery, almost to a man." People have asked me in my research about that, and we always debate about whether they fought to uphold the Union, to end slavery, or maybe both causes. Most of the Lansing boys made no bones about the reason they were fighting. You have obliterated every vestige of that cursed institution, slavery. You left your homes, your firesides, your wives, your families, and those most dear and near to you, and volunteered. Well have you done your duty. There are but few among us whose persons do not show the marks of rebel missiles. Let those scars be an honor to you." I love that quote. Let those scars be an honor to you. I bid you an affectionate farewell. And one of the conditions of soldier correspondent, he would also be wounded in the fight at Spotsylvania, leading to the amputation of his right foot. He would, however, remarkably survive the amputation. Came home to Lansing and worked as a clerk in the Auditor General's office in the old Capitol. I think the next piece of research I want to do is on all the boys that ended up with jobs in the state capitol. And Michigan started a long-standing tradition then of employing veterans, especially disabled veterans, to work in the building as security officers or sergeants at arms, or working in the clerks as clerks in the different departments. I've run across a bunch of them in my research on this book. Eventually, Edward would join the seminary, became a very well-respected and revered priest in the Episcopal Church, ministering to his congregation in St. Joseph, Missouri, and also serving in the Grand Army of the Republic. Flower would serve as a chaplain to the GAR in the Missouri Command, dying in 1911 with the directive that he be buried, not in his soldier's uniform, but in his priestly vestments. So I already spoke about this. I knew very early on in writing this book that in good conscience there was no way I could personally benefit financially from the sale of it. And these stories like that of Edward Flower could not be told for personal profit. So what I'm sure will be tons of dollars that will be generated from the sale of my book, all of that money goes toward perpetuating the memory of these courageous men and their families through the preservation of the battle flags that the boys fought beneath. And it'll also go towards erecting a monument at the Antietam battlefield. We actually have the property purchased already. It's just down the road from the Dunker Church, very close to where this photograph was taken. At the conclusion of the war, each man came home to Lansing with the unstated question left unanswered. How does a returning soldier pick up the pieces of a life abandoned 4 years earlier, taking to his domicile the memories of horrendous sights, sounds, and actions better left deeply buried and unspoken? The soldiers carried home with them the weighty, unbearable burden of the guilt of Cain for having slain his own brother. They also carried with them, in my mind, perhaps the even heavier burden of their mere and yet their most audacious act of survival, while so many comrades and boyhood friends perished round and about them in the struggle. How does a former soldier, in his newly reclaimed daily life of a citizen, face the parents, the wives, and the children of friends buried in their blood-soaked uniforms in shallow, hastily dug graves so far away from the great shores of Michigan and the quiet, peaceful streets of Lansing? Please, I beg of you, let us not forget them. Let them know and feel that they are remembered and cared for at home, and that they are dear to us, for we have indeed given of the best we have. Thank you so much for your attention and your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Just thanks for coming out tonight. I appreciate you all being here. Anyone have any? Yeah, please.
After surviving Saturday's event, what changes would you make if you had to do it again?
To the event?
Yeah.
Quicker sign-in at the front. You guys had to wait in line a bit. I would have tried to, again, I mentioned earlier, and it kills me is when people feel slighted when we have an event like this, that they didn't receive an invitation or didn't hear about it. In 30 years of working on this project, I've interacted with a lot of different people, and sadly I'm only human, and I tried to remember as many people as I could, but there were a number of folks that I thought of, literally woke up at night with a start thinking, oh geez, you forgot to invite them or even tell them about the event. So I am trying to put together a better list of supporters. In fact, the email I sent out to some of you encourages you to subscribe to our news section on our website. It's free of charge, but you'll get updates on things that are going on with the project. And I'm going to, from now on, really try to encourage people to do that so they get word of all these different events that take place. So, do you have a suggestion? Because I'm all ears.
No, you did good.
Did I? I appreciate that. I will. That's kind of you. I had a list pinned up in my office for years that said the steps of any project or any event, and it starts with super excitement for the event, fear and dreading of the event, and then at the end, the last one is accolades for all those not involved. And I was at a couple of points, fear and dreading, because you start into these and you think this is going to be awesome, and then you get bogged down in the details and the work of it, but it was well worth it. Seeing all of you folks there and seeing those flags fly was a really worthwhile thing, I think. So that was a lot. Yeah, please.
I had a question. The flags were like representational of
They
what-
were, yeah.
Tell me about
So they
how
were
that was
generic. So when those replica battle flags were made, when the originals were removed in 1990 from the rotunda, honestly, they didn't have a lot of money in the budget, and they didn't want to spend money that they could have been spending on the original flags, on making really accurate reproductions. So they did sort of generic reproductions, and even those, it was thousands and thousands of dollars to have 80 replica flags made. So I think a few people were a little disappointed because the replica didn't look exactly like the original flag does. But I'll be honest with you too, the flags are so crammed into those cases, you really wouldn't be able to even ascertain, what was on each individual flag. And I'll throw Carrie under the bus because she started the project and made the decision. But when I came onto this, it was the right decision to make. She did get some seed money from the restoration to buy racks for the storage unit at the museum. And that's really about the only time the state has really saw fit to fund the project. I did get an appropriation last year from the state for the first time, 30-year project, first appropriation from the legislature. So so that's kind of a long description, but they made the decision to spend the funds on the flags themselves and not on making more accurate reproductions. Yes. Other questions? Yeah.
Being a retired state employee and veteran, does it say how many buildings, how many, the Capitol, how big the Capitol was at that time period?
Oh, you mean when it's open in '79? You mean?
No, way back, when you're looking way back there in the 18...
Oh, at the first Lansing Capitol?
Yeah, does it say
I
how
was
many?
small. I think we do have that, but it escapes me. Top of my head, I can't tell you what the square footage was, but as soon as it was built quickly, so that first Lansing Capitol that I showed in my presentation was always meant to be temporary. Lansing was picked after a lot of debate in Detroit, but they scooted up to Lansing and built it really quickly. They didn't intend to use it 30 years. Part of the reason they used it so long was the Civil War. Michigan was spending all of its resources on the war effort, and they didn't want to build a new capital. They didn't have the money for it. So about 7 years after the end of the war is when they laid the foundation for the new building. So, but yeah, it was very small, hastily built wooden structure. Plus, part of the reason they wanted a permanent capitol, where I work now, is they wanted a fireproof place to store the battle flags because they recognized the old capitol was wood, and in fact, it burned shortly after the new capitol opened.
So the present building was built when?
1879 it opened in '79, and the first Lansing Capitol was built in '47. Yeah, when Lansing was first.
Where was that
named.
one at?
So just around the corner, really, from the Capitol, down near Washington Square. Yeah, just literally just around the corner from where the present Capitol is. Any other questions? Again, thanks so much. Appreciate your support.
Just a couple little housekeeping things to take care of. If anybody here deserves an award, it's my wife for putting up with me. I'm sure some nights she rolls her eyes when all I talk about is the museum. So, it's tradition that we give a certificate of appreciation to any of our speakers, so I present Matt VanAcker the certificate of appreciation. And other eyes grow dull and other hands slack and other hearts cold in solemn trust, ours shall keep it well as long as the warmth and light of life remains to us. It's in us, folks. This is how it stays alive, is with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
The upstairs is open for tours if you'd like a tour.